you ever stopped to think about all the things that we automatically trust in life? We go through life, and every day we wake up, and we just kind of go on in our regular, typical routines, trusting so many things without thinking about it. Really, alarm clocks, okay? Maybe pre-phone alarm clocks were harder to trust, especially on those time change Sundays. Will you remember to set it back? Will you move it forward, whatever? Will it wake me up? Will it just ring once and then stop? What about that kind of thing too? To backup warning on cars. How many of you have the backup camera in your car? Okay, how many of you trust the little distance measure? It goes from green to yellow to red. How many of you love riding in the red? Okay, how many of you have the one that not just has the colors, but has the beep? And you're like, beep, 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 beep. And you're like, how close can I get? First service, I said that, and this one lady starts jabbing her husband, and I'm like, don't park by him. But we trust so many things. Smart devices, right? And smart devices, they're great when they're really smart, but when they're kind of dumb, they're not great. This past year, we changed from a really bad smart thermostats on our property to a different one. But still, you walk in on any event or a Sunday morning, and you're like, I really hope they're working. You walk in, you feel it kind of cool, and it's like, nice. So if you're warm today, it's not me, it's the dumb thermostats. But it's one of those, we trust so many things without thinking about it. Tomorrow, our high schoolers, they will trust water slides. Right? Will this hold? They don't look at those can I see your safety inspection and make sure that I'm not going to die? I doubt any of the students will do that. They'll just willingly nearly die and have a ton of fun while at it. But that's just we go through life. We get to look at the life of the Israelites, and they have a thing or two to teach us about trust and obedience. Sometimes they teach us because of the good, and sometimes, and really more often than not, they teach us because of their lack of trust in God. But we're going to look at and follow kind of their journey and see what it really looks like to trust and obey God. And so often, God teaches us to trust Him by providing exactly what we need one day at a time, which is what we're going to see today. And we're going to pick up their journey right where Pastor Byron left off last week, and that's in Exodus chapter 15. And we're just going to read the first part of verse 22. And it says this, Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. They just crossed the Red Sea, okay? And now they're here. And what do they do when they cross the Red Sea? They worship God. It's the perfect response. And Pastor Byron looked at that last week, that worship is a response. It's a response to what God has done. God leads them through the Red Sea, and their response is to worship Him. How great is that? Now, today we want to look at 4 parts of the next phase of their journey. And again, this is where we're going to see where God proves Himself so trustworthy and what we can learn and what they should have learned about trusting and obeying in God. We start with this. We start with their past experiences. And really, if you've been with us over the past series of months, about the past 4 months when we've been in the book of Exodus, here's some things we've seen. We've seen the Israelites enslaved in Egypt. We've seen that when Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and ask that he release the Israelites, Pharaoh made their work harder. We've seen them endure the plagues. We've seen God protect them through that. We've seen them walk through the worst of the plagues in the Passover, and again, how God provided perfectly for them. We've seen that when they were driven out of Egypt, not just told to leave, but driven out of Egypt, that Pharaoh begins to pursue them. They're no longer just free to go. He chases them down. And then we see them get what they would feel like trapped between the Red Sea and this Egyptian army pursuing them. And then we see God miraculously part the waters so that they could go through. In each of these things that they experienced, they saw God move on their behalf. They saw God do amazing things. And these experiences gave them a chance to deepen their trust and obedience in God. Yet, if you've been with us, what we've seen is they trust God until things get tough. Until things maybe go away that they don't expect or that they quite honestly don't really like. And that leads us into where we pick up today. And again, it's their present situation. We're going to look at really what's going on right now. This is the past. This is where they've been, things that have been going on. But where are they at today? And in their present situation, the Israelites struggle to trust God. One would think that with all they'd gone through, that they wouldn't struggle with this at all. That trust should come easy for them. But it doesn't. And the first thing that we see them do is this. They complained about water. In chapter 15, verse 22 through 24, it says this, "For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What are we going to drink?'" Now, 3 days traveling in the desert without water would have been brutal, right? Think about it. In those conditions, 3 days without water would be the most that a person could survive. And they don't look back on what had happened to them just 3 days earlier and think, oh, God's got this. What do? They complain to Moses. They grumble to Moses. But think of this, 3 days. 3 days ago, the sea split for them to walk through it. 3 days ago, they watched the Egyptian army drown. 3 days ago, they sang songs of worship. 3 days later, God must have abandoned us. God led us through all that to bring us here to not have water and to die. They look at their current situation and they complain to Moses. What are we to drink? Now, as we look at the different parts today, we're not going to go numerically through our verses. We're going to jump around a little bit, kind of look at different things that they're facing as we go. So just so you're aware, we're going to get through all of these verses in a different kind of order. We could have really extended it into the first half of chapter 17, but I think if you would have saw 15 to 17, you would have thought we'd be here all day. But no, we have Missions Palooza tonight we need you to be at. So you can read beginning of 17 later and see more. But now they go, okay, they complained about water, not having water. What are we going to drink? Now, this is about a month later. What do? They complain about food. Verses 1 to 3 of chapter 16. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they came out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all that we wanted. But you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." About a month later, they end up in the desert of Sin. Now, real quick, desert of Sin, it's a geographical location. The word sin is not what we would consider the word sin today. It wasn't meaning like they were in some sinful place or it was called the desert of Sin because of their own actions. It's just the name of where they were. And it's affiliated with, it's related to Sinai, but really its meaning is really uncertain. And as they get there, here, think of the Israelites. What do they remember? Oh, they remember the good old days of Egypt. Oh, how great they had it. Oh, in Egypt, oh, we sat around pots of meat. We had all the food we could handle. That's what they're remembering. They're forgetting, obviously, they were slaves. They had no freedoms. Their work got harder. That's what they forget. And I think at times we can be that way. We long for these good old days. When something gets hard, we look back to maybe a time in our life, and maybe it was a time we weren't walking with the Lord, and we look and we long for those days. They're forgetting that hardship. They're also probably using some hyperbole here. Okay, Pharaoh probably provided them with food, or they probably had food, but probably not as good or as much as they're talking about. Probably wasn't all these vast pots. It wasn't probably this endless buffet, right? It was probably enough food to sustain themselves. But they continue longing for Egypt and not the salvation that God offered them. They'd been freed. They were no longer slaves. God had done all these things for them. And here's another time that they should have cried out to God, but instead they complained and they grumbled to Moses. And now Moses, he responds in two different ways here. The first is this. In chapter 15, when they complain about not having water, Moses' response is this. He cries out to the Lord. Verse 25, the first half of verse 25 and 15 says this. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. You'll have to wait to hear more about the wood in a few minutes. But that's what happened. Moses, maybe he even agreed. Maybe his attitude was, Lord, what are you doing? You brought us here. Now we have no water. And he could have chimed in with them and been like, yeah, you're right. This is not good. This stinks. I don't know what's going on. Moses is one who, again, if you think back over all that we've studied, there early on in Moses' life, what does he do? God continues to say, I'm going to use you. I'm going to do this. Moses resists time after time after time. At some point in Moses' life, at one point, something clicks, and Moses is a different person. He gets it, and now he is trusting God each and every time. And when the Israelites grumble, when they complain throughout the book of Exodus, Moses continues to remain faithful to the Lord. He continues to cry out to the Lord. And it's okay. It's okay when we cry out to the Lord when we're in the middle of something we don't understand. It's okay to complain to God. As long as our complaining is done in a position of trust and faith in God. God, I don't like this. I wish it wasn't this way. But Lord, I'm going to trust you with this. I know you are working. I know you have a plan. I'm going to look to you and trust you in this. So don't feel like you can't complain to God. I mean, God already knows our complaints. He knows our thoughts. So you're not, by you hiding it, you're not protecting God from your true feelings. So go ahead, complain, but complain from a place of faith and trust. And again, Moses faces it. He cries out to God. He knows that God is in charge and that God cares for them. Moses was better at remembering all that God had done for them, and he trusted God. They continue to forget. They continue to grumble and complain, but Moses trusts God. Moses cries out to the Lord, and then the next thing we see is this, is Moses tells it like it is. I love this in chapter 16, verses 6 to 8. They've grumbled and they've complained about not having food, wishing they were back in Egypt. And Moses does this. It says, so Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. And in this, what we see is this. Moses tells them two different things. He says, God's the one who led you out here. In verse 6, it's what it says. And it's one of those Moses reminded them, God brought you here. They were following the pillar, right? The pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. It was there. It was present. They could go out of their tent in the morning, look up, and see that God is there. They're not in this desert of sin or the desert of Shur without water. They're not there by any kind of mistake. It wasn't like they were going along and took a wrong turn. We're told that wherever the pillar led, they followed. And that lasts the entire journey through the wilderness, the entire journey through the desert. They're following this pillar. So God led them right where they wanted. And this situation that they're in didn't catch God off guard. It wasn't like, I guess I should have taken you somewhere with food. I should have led you to where there was water. No, God has a perfect plan for them. And that should also remind us that the situations we face, they're not catching God off guard either. We can look to God and trust him. Moses also tells them that You're grumbling against God, not us. In verse 8, he says they were grumbling against Moses and Aaron, but in reality, they were grumbling against God. God led them there. It was part of his plan. In Psalms 106, we read, when our ancestors were in Egypt, they gave no thought to your miracles. They did not remember your many kindnesses, and they rebelled by the sea, the Red Sea. And really, their complaining, their rebellion goes far beyond food and water. Ultimately, it's complaining against food and water, but in reality, what they're complaining against is God's plan for their salvation. They're complaining against that God saved them from slavery, that God brought them out of Egypt. If only we would have been in Egypt and died there. We had all the food, we had all the water. Why did you save us, God? That's their ultimate complaining. They don't like what has happened to them. They wish that God hadn't saved them. In their opinion, life would be better. And again, how quick they are to forget. Yet in chapter 16, 4 different times, we see God hearing their grumbling. Verse 7 says, because he heard your grumbling against him. Verse 8 says the same thing, because he heard your grumbling against him. Verse 9, then Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. In verse 12, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. God is a God who is present. God is a God who hears. He's not ignoring their situation. He's not ignoring their feelings. He knows, he cares. He has the perfect plan. We need to be able to trust him that his plan is perfect. They're not doing so well with that. And probably at times we don't either. But God heard their grumbling, and that leads us to the next part of their journey, which is God's provision. What did God do? He heard their grumbling. Did he just hear them complaining and say, well, no big deal? You know, think of it. You know, if you're on a road trip and you got little kids in the car and they're whining and complaining, when are we going to get there? How much farther? And you're like, don't worry about it. You know, and parents, you get kind of frustrated or tired of it, you know, or maybe snap back at your kids or whatever. And God could have done that. Been like, will you guys ever learn? I am so sick and tired of this. Good luck, right? God doesn't do this. Notice this, the Israelites complained, God still provided. That doesn't mean he approved their complaining, but it means his grace preceded their obedience. And again, that's the gospel. Sometimes we think if I trusted God better, then God would provide. Instead, God provides, which leads us to trust, or should lead us to trust. Grace comes before growth. And that's a beautiful thread we see through the book of Exodus. But in God's provision, we're going to see 3 miracles. The first miracle is the miracle of the water. Okay, clean water. They, again, verse 25, they go and they get to this water, but the water is bitter. It's not drinkable. And again, you can imagine they're on this 3-day journey, and on the horizon, they begin to see this body of water, and they're probably excited. We're not going to die. They get and they try this water, and it's not drinkable. It's too bitter. So Moses cries out to the Lord, and it said, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. So God uses this wood to purify the water. And again, as people often do, and we've seen through the plagues, we've seen through even the parting of the Red Sea, is people try to explain how natural things could have caused this to happen. And it says Moses threw a piece of wood in. Think about how big this body of water would have needed to be to give drink to the 2 million Israelites. It wasn't just this small little basin of water, but one piece of wood purified the whole water and purified it instantaneously. They didn't have to go up and use one of those life straws, right? Like, I'm going to use this. That's real trust if you trust a life straw. Anyway, side note. It says, but the water they found was bitter. It wasn't good to drink. Moses cries out, sees a piece of wood, and it's purified. Now they have water to drink. And again, this is 3 days after parting the Red Sea. And again, they have another miracle to see that should have caused them to learn that God is trustworthy. But it doesn't. Now they complain about food, and that's where we see the second miracle, the second and third, really. The second miracle is in the quail. God provides quail for them to eat. In verses, a few different verses, little bits of the verses 8, 12, and 13. Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat." Verse 13, that evening quail came and covered the camp. And quail was a delicacy in Egypt. It wasn't just this kind of basic food. It was the nicest food they could get. And that's so often what God does for us is he provides what we need, but kind of blesses us along the way. And it wasn't just something simple. It was a meal they would remember. We went to Nicaragua for years, and we would serve with the Diaz family. And if you were with us on any of those trips, you would probably agree with me when I say the food was mostly edible. Okay, there were some things where like, that's not real good. They had this fried cheese that they thought Americans like. We don't. But they would, I would always tell our team, just try it, man. Don't take a bunch. Just try a little. But this one year, we'd done our time out with the Diazes, and we were moving to the Busbys, which was this missionary family that had this beautiful missionary compound. And we went in there, and the meal they served us that night was a meal we would remember, well, some of us, for years. It was a meal that, it was so good. And really, the meal was like stew and rice, right? It wasn't like this, but it was just, so good. And I think of that when I think of this, God provided the quail for them. And this was a one-time event. This wasn't that God provided quail every evening for them, but this one evening God provided quail for them. It was as if God was here providing for their immediate need and kind of showing them, I will take care of your immediate need. There's a similar time in Numbers 11 where God provides quail, but it's a different time. It's not related to this. And again, people have tried to explain, well, if you look at the migratory patterns of the quail, that's why there was quail for them to eat. But I would encourage, think of this. The quail were at the right place at the right time and in the right amount. Moses wasn't sitting here planning his journey, or God wasn't planning the journey to get there so that it would just land so Moses could say this evening. And then that just happened to be the time that all these quail were going to come by. And it says right place, right time, and the right amount. It says quail covered the camp. And we get to the third miracle, which is the manna. Okay, the manna, the bread they would eat. Verses 4 and 5. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and to gather enough for the day. In this way, I will test them to see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to gather, they're to prepare what they bring in. And that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Verse 8 says, and all the bread you want in the morning. Verse 12, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Verses 13 to 16, that evening quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. They'd never seen anything like it. They'd never tasted anything like this. When they see it, they ask, what is this? And actually, manna is the Hebrew translation for the question that they ask. What is it? In Hebrew, the Hebrew words are manna. So that's a clever name, right? But that's what it is. It's no one really knows, but it's manna that God provided for them. And he provided this daily for them for 40 years, the entire time they journeyed through the desert and in the wilderness until they reached the promised land. Every morning, God provided manna for them. Joshua 5:12 says, the manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. God's faithfulness continued for them every day. God's faithfulness to us will continue every day until we enter into heaven. And then we will experience his faithfulness in full. Well, really, what is manna? In verse 31, it says, the people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. So we don't really know, but it sounds like it would be good. Psalm 105, verse 40, calls it the bread of heaven. Now, how were they to gather this manna? What is the gathering of manna? Verses 16 to 18 says, this is what the Lord commanded. Every one of you is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some gathered little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. And an omer, just so you know, it's about 3 pounds. It's about 3 pounds of bread. Some of you are probably going, man, I would love to eat 3 pounds of bread a day. Were they donuts? I don't know. But they were told to go out and gather as much as they needed for their house, for their household. And everyone did. They didn't have too much. They didn't have too little. They had just the right amount. Also, they were to go out in the morning before the sun melted away. There was no room for laziness here in the Israelite camp. They were to go out. They were to get it in the morning. And they were told to not keep it overnight or it would go bad. But again, some are slow to listen and slow to learn. Verses 19 and 20 tells us that. Then Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until morning. Verse 20, however, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. It's as if God was saying, will you trust me every day? Don't save any. Trust me for tomorrow. And it's easy for us, for often to be able to go, I trust God, but I also know I have savings or I have this, and so I don't fully have to trust. God's telling them, don't save any. Trust me. Moses got angry with them. I don't blame him. I was like, guys, will you learn? Look at all that God has done. He has proven himself trustworthy time and time again. Trust him. Trust him with what you need tomorrow. They were also told to gather a double portion on the 6th day to prepare for the Sabbath. This is the first time we see Sabbath presented in the Bible. We'll learn more in a few weeks when we get to Exodus 20, but for now it's first introduced. And what is it? Here it's said to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. In verses 21 to 30, it says, however, some of them paid no attention to Moses and kept part until morning. Or that's verse 21. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed. And when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, this is what the Lord commands. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning. So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the Sabbath day, or on the 7th day, to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are. On the 7th day, no one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. Now again, this in itself would be another thing they should be able to look at and go, we know because some of our friends, not me, they kept it overnight and it smelled bad and had maggots in it. But now we're told to keep it another day. And they keep it another day and it is fine. It is good to eat. Yet some still go out not fully trusting and they look for it. And God goes, how long will you refuse to keep my commands? I think that's a question for us. How long will we continue to not trust God? How long will we continue to think We know better than God. How long will I continue to try to do things my way? And manna here is used to teach them to depend on God. But for us, manna points to Jesus. Manna in the Old Testament is a type, or it's a picture of Jesus. Jesus who came to give himself as the bread of life for sinners. In John 6, verses 47 to 51, says, "Very truly I tell you, the one who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." God gave manna for Israel, but he sent his son for the whole world. And manna sustains their physical life, but Jesus gives us eternal life in heaven. They daily were to eat the manna to be sustained, and we're to feed on Jesus to be sustained, reading, studying his word, meditating on God's word, obeying God's word, prayer, fellowship with other believers. We do that and we feed on Jesus to be sustained. And morning by morning, they saw God's mercy through the manna. As morning after morning, it was there. In 40 years, I wonder if there was ever a point that they still would go out and wonder, will it be here today? But morning after morning it was there. It reminds me of Lamentations 3, 22 and 23, where it says, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." And the final part of their journey is this: they're told to keep a regular reminder, to remind themselves of God's faithfulness. In verses 32, we read, "Then Moses said, 'This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so that they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt.' So Moses said to Aaron, 'Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for generations to come.' As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law so that it might be preserved. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to the land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan." This jar of manna would serve, again, as that reminder of God's faithfulness to them and all that God had done. When they would see it, they would remember. This part of the passage appears to have been written later because it references putting the manna in with the tablets and stuff like that. That's in the Ark of the Covenant, which, again, we'll get to. So just a little, if that confused you at all, just know that. But the Israelites, they are, again, we've seen forgetful people. They would need this as a reminder. And again, they're told to do this so that generations to come could look back. We saw that same thing with the Passover when it was said, when your kids ask you what this means, tell them this. So it can serve as that reminder. And so the question we can ask ourselves is this: how can I learn to trust and obey God? It starts with being able to trust God with small things. God really used two small, regular things, food and water, to teach them to trust. Now, maybe you're like, food and water, not real small things, but normal, everyday things that they would need just to survive. God's saying, do you trust me with your very survival? Trust me with this. And sometimes maybe our attitude is, I can trust God. I trust God. I can trust him with these big things. Yet the little day in, day out things we don't always trust God with. I would think we won't really be able to trust God in the big moments when we really need to trust him if we can't trust him with the small things in life. And for probably most of us, it won't be food and water, but maybe for some it is. I'm trusting God, which is my very basic daily needs. Tonight at Missions Palooza, you'll hear stories of our different trips. And our trip to Costa Rica we'll be sharing, and we serve with the Benedict family. And they tell us they have these kind of stories where they were, as a family, just not knowing where their next meal would come. And then there'd be a knock on their door. And someone just would show up and be like, God, put on my heart to bring you and your family this. that's the things we can experience when we go on mission trips, is seeing people who live differently than we do, where their daily dependence looks a little different than ours. We probably know where our lunch is coming from. Not church today, I'll tell you that. There isn't. But your dinner can be provided tonight, okay? But we don't typically wonder. We know, right? It's in our fridge. It's whatever. But what are those small things that we need to trust God with? Also, we learn to trust God by what I would call open-handed living, where we just, God, whatever you want from me, I want to do. God, wherever you want to lead me, I want to follow. I want to do what you want me to do. The picture from Isaiah 6:8 comes to mind for me. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And I said, here I am, send me. That's what we need to be is, God, I'm going to trust you. God, where you lead me, I want to follow. God, I want to be obedient. And we can start our relationship with God often with open hands. But over time, we really begin to do this. We begin to close our hands. So I would encourage you to think about, are you really living to trust God? That if God was to say, I want you to do this, would you follow? Would you be obedient? Do you trust God with your job? Do you trust God with your kids? Do you trust God with your money? And maybe that one hits home the most, because that is a very basic, tangible thing. When you're at church and they talk about tithing, sometimes I think we can get the opinion that tithing is all about money. Tithing, really, it's about putting God first in everything and trusting him with really our basic needs. And tithing more is about, do we trust God? Matthew 6:33 says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. As we genuinely seek to trust God, God will provide for us. Not in a prosperity gospel kind of way, but in a God will meet our needs. And I think a lot of times it is beyond even what we need and a lot of our wants. But also, is to help us learn to trust God, I would encourage us to keep jars of manna. Not literal jars of bread, okay? But what are those memories? What are those things in your life you can look back on and go, this is where I saw God moving. This is where I saw God's provision. This is the time I experienced God's faithfulness to me. And when you see that, I would encourage you to take note of it. Share it with your kids. Write it down. Do something so you can remember this time in your life. Often we remember yesterday's problems more than we remember yesterday's miracles in our lives. And these jars can help us remember that God is trustworthy. So what are your jars? Is it a journal? Do you have an answered prayer list? Maybe family stories, photos, financial miracles, baptism certificates. And sometimes I think we overlook some of the simple things of God moving in our life and don't even really attribute it to God moving. But I would encourage you to start looking at things different. Look at that. This is God's provision. This is how God moved here. This was a time when God led me, and I can see God's hand, his faithfulness, so easy. Tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up, and you're going to go on with your day trusting all sorts of things without even thinking. First, you'll trust your alarm to wake you up. You'll trust the brakes on your car. You'll trust your coffee maker. Maybe too much, but you'll trust that. The question isn't whether we will trust. The question is, what will we trust? And the question is really, will we trust God who's already proven himself faithful to us? Just like Israel, tomorrow morning, God will give you today's bread. And will you trust him for today? And the good thing about God is this: God will never do anything that would cause us to lose trust in him. God is good, and God is faithful, and God is worthy of our trust. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that you are a good, trustworthy God, that you are faithful. God, what you have said in your word will come about, and we can trust you for that. God, I pray that each of us would look at our lives and see genuinely how much we trust you. God, do we trust you with our basic daily needs? Is trusting you an afterthought? God, I pray that our ultimate trust would be in you. Trust for what we need each day, and God, most importantly, trust for our salvation. That God, that we know if we've trusted in Christ as our Savior, God, that one day we will spend eternity with you. And we thank you for that, God. Father, we love you. In Jesus' name, amen.